He thought his badge made him untouchable, until he crossed the wrong woman. One arrest, one viral video, and now his career is crumbling. Suspended under investigation and facing charges, his power is slipping fast. But for her, this is just the beginning. The system protected him for years, but not this time. Want to see how one woman turned the tables on a corrupt officer? Keep watching, because this story is far from over. He thought she was just another woman he could intimidate, just another person who would fold under pressure. But when she stepped into that courtroom, she didn't just defend herself, she dismantled his entire career. The road was dark and mostly empty that night, the hum of passing cars filling the air as headlights reflected off the wet pavement. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the stretch of highway outside Birmingham, Alabama. It was late, just past 11, the kind of hour when most people just wanted to get home. Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson had been driving for nearly 2 hours, fingers drumming against the wheel as an old jazz tune hummed softly through the speakers. She wasn't in uniform tonight, just a simple black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back, blending in, or so she thought. Then flashing lights, red and blue in her rearview mirror gaining fast, her stomach clenched. Not in fear, she knew how these things went, but out of sheer exhaustion, another unnecessary stop, another power trip. She sighed, signaling as she eased her car onto the shoulder. With calm precision, she put the car in park, took a slow breath, and kept both hands where they could be seen. Routine. A white patrol car rolled to a stop behind her, the officer inside taking his time before stepping out. When he finally did, he moved with the kind of swagger that spoke volumes. Someone who expected to be obeyed. Heavy boots scuffed against the asphalt, a flashlight flicking on as he approached. She turned slightly, watching through the side mirror. The name on his badge caught the light. Briggs. No greeting, no explanation, just a flat, impatient command. License and registration. Renee met his gaze in the mirror before reaching for the glove compartment. Slow movements, deliberate. She knew the drill. As she handed over her documents, she kept her voice steady. "Was I speeding, officer?" Briggs didn't answer right away. He held her papers just out of reach, giving her car a once-over before finally responding. "Tail lights out." She frowned. That couldn't be right. "That's strange," she said, calm but firm. "I had them checked a few weeks ago." Briggs's gaze snapped back to hers, his smirk barely hidden. "Are you arguing with me?" Silence. A shift in the air. That quiet moment where power meets resistance, and one side expects the other to break. She'd seen it before, overseas, in training, in situations where control was a currency. She could push back, or she could play along. But she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she continued measured, "if there's an issue, I'll get it fixed." Briggs cut her off. "Step out of the car," she blinked. "Mind telling me why?" Briggs tilted his head, smirking. "Because I said so." A beat of silence. Then, without a word, she unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. The night air was cooler than she expected. She stepped onto the pavement, posture relaxed but controlled. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wasn't about to be bullied either. Briggs took a step back, scanning her. He was assessing, calculating, deciding how much he could get away with. "Turn around. Hands on the car." This time she hesitated. "For what reason?" Briggs's smirk vanished. He stepped closer, voice sharpening. "Are you resisting?" No, she replied evenly. I'm asking a question. Something flickered across his face. Annoyance, maybe amusement. Then without warning, he reached for his radio. Got a non-compliant driver here. His voice was casual, like this was just another part of his routine. Then louder, turn around. Renee's pulse remained steady. Her military training kicked in. She knew exactly what he was doing, and she knew exactly what he couldn't do. Officer, she said, her voice low but firm, I need you to understand something. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do. Briggs's jaw tightened. He didn't like that. You're under arrest. His tone snapped, his hand reaching for her wrist. She moved before he could grab her, stepping back just enough to stay out of reach. Under arrest for what? He yanked out his cuffs, obstructing an officer. So that was his game. Renee took a slow breath. Two choices, comply and fight this later, or resist and risk escalation. She wasn't about to be another statistic. With deliberate calm, she turned, placing her hands on the roof of her car. The metal was cool against her palms. Briggs wasted no time, yanking her arms behind her back, tightening the cuffs too much before shoving her toward the patrol car. You don't know what you're doing, she murmured. Briggs chuckled. Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing. But he didn't, not even close. The hard plastic seat of the patrol car dug into her back as the door slammed shut. Outside, Briggs strutted back to his vehicle, muttering into his radio. She watched his reflection in the partition. He had no idea who she was, no idea what was coming. A few minutes passed, then 5, then 10. She flexed her fingers slightly, testing the cuffs. Too tight, deliberately so. Then, the driver's side door swung open. Briggs slid in, still whistling. Well, well, he muttered, buckling in. Let's take a little ride. She didn't respond. He threw the car into gear, pulling back onto the road, red and blue lights still flashing. You know, Briggs mused, most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out. Renee exhaled sharply. And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop. Briggs laughed. Lady, you must really think you're somebody. She looked at him through the glass. I don't think. I know. That made him pause. Just for a second. His knuckles flexed around the wheel, irritation flickering in his eyes before he covered it up with a smirk. You military? He asked suddenly, his tone shifting. She didn't answer. Yeah, he said, as if confirming it for himself. You got that attitude, that above-the-law type. He smirked. Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh? Still, she stayed silent. Briggs clicked his tongue. Shame. If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this. Her jaw tightened. The audacity of it. Acting like this was her fault. Up ahead, the station came into view. A squat grey building off the main road, the parking lot nearly empty. Briggs pulled into a reserved spot, killed the engine, and turned to look at her through the partition. Gotta say, he murmured, I do love when they make it easy. Before she could respond, he was out of the car, slamming the door behind him. A second later, her door swung open. Let's go. Renee twisted her wrists slightly as she stepped out. The cuffs bit into her skin. He hadn't loosened them at all. But that was fine. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. His stride had that same arrogant rhythm. The kind of walk that belonged to a man who thought he was untouchable. He moved with purpose, with an air of self-importance that made it clear he believed he owned this moment. And when he appeared in front of the cell, arms crossed over his chest, that insufferable smirk still painted on his face, she knew exactly how this would play out. "Comfy?" His voice dripped with condescension. Renee didn't answer. She didn't even shift, just sat there, still as stone, her hands resting on her lap as if she had all the time in the world. Briggs tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars, his confidence unwavering. "You know," he mused, "if you had just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." A slow, knowing smile curled at the edges of her lips. It was subtle, controlled. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." For just a second, just the briefest flicker of a moment, his smirk faltered. There was something in his eyes, annoyance, uncertainty. But he covered it fast, scoffing as he glanced toward the empty holding area beyond her cell. "No one's coming to get you tonight," he said with a shrug. "Guess that means you'll have some time to think about that attitude." Renee just watched him, unmoved, unshaken. Briggs leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "See, here's the thing," he continued, his tone dropping into something quieter, something meant to intimidate. "People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence is enough to get out of trouble." She let him talk, let him ramble. It didn't matter because he didn't know what was coming. And then, as if on cue, another officer appeared from the hallway. He was younger, probably in his late 20s, dressed in a standard-issue uniform. There was something hesitant in the way he approached, how he stopped a few feet away, gripping a clipboard like it was a lifeline. Sergeant?" The officer's voice carried a trace of unease. "We got a call." Briggs barely glanced at him. "And?" The younger officer shifted on his feet. "I think you need to see this." Briggs frowned, irritation flashing across his face. He hesitated then, with a last sharp look at Renee, turned and strode toward the officer. She didn't have to strain to hear their hushed conversation. Bits and pieces filtered through. Lawyer. Higher up. Questions about why she's being held. Briggs' voice was a low, sharp growl in response. The younger officer stammered something back, but whatever it was, it didn't seem to satisfy him. Then came the heavy footsteps. Briggs stormed back, jaw clenched, hands curled into fists at his sides. The smirk was gone. His composure cracked. "What the hell did you do?" he hissed. Renee leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I didn't do anything." She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. "But people talk, and some of us have friends in very high places." His face darkened. She could see it now, that moment of realization creeping in, the shift in power. He wasn't in control anymore. Briggs turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath, and disappeared down the hallway. She exhaled, slow and measured. It wouldn't be long now. And when the truth came out, Briggs was going to regret every single decision that led him here. Morning light spilled through the narrow windows of the courthouse, casting long streaks across the polished floors. The air inside was crisp, the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones if you sat still too long. Renee stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. No handcuffs, no orange jumpsuit, just a well-tailored navy blue blazer, a simple blouse, and an undeniable presence. Beside her, Carla Whitman, her attorney, flipped through a stack of papers, barely glancing up as people trickled into the courtroom. Carla was efficient, methodical, no wasted movements, no small talk. Renee liked that. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Briggs walked in. He still carried himself like he owned the room. Shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted. But there was a difference now, a stiffness in his step, a flicker of something in his expression that hadn't been there before. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. Renee caught his eye. He looked away. Good. The judge entered and the room quieted. Judge Alan Kirkland, an older man with a weary expression, adjusted his glasses as he settled in. He didn't waste time. "All right," he sighed, glancing over the case files. "Let's get to it." The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs." A murmur rippled through the room. Briggs shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. The judge peered at him over his glasses. "Sergeant Briggs, care to explain?" Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop." The prosecutor cut him off. "Uncooperative?" He lifted a document. "Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record shows a distinguished military career. Graduate of the Naval Academy, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that despite all this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken taillight?" Briggs opened his mouth, then shut it. The silence stretched. The prosecutor continued, flipping through his papers. "Additionally, an internal review of your arrest history shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district." The murmurs grew louder. Judge Kirkland set his file down with a sigh. "Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing." Briggs sat back, crossing his arms. "She resisted." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "The body cam footage says otherwise." A screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. A video began to play. Renee didn't turn to watch. She had lived it. Briggs barking orders, her calm voice, the unnecessary escalation, the smug way he tightened the cuffs. The room was dead silent when the footage ended. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Sergeant Briggs, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your initial statement." Briggs opened his mouth. The judge wasn't done. "The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed." The gavel came down, sharp, final. Briggs looked like he had been punched in the gut. Renee exhaled, controlled, steady. She never had a doubt. As she stood collecting her things, she glanced toward Briggs one last time. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be, because this time she wasn't the one who had to fight for her reputation. Briggs was. The air in the office was thick with tension. The words struck like a hammer. "You're being put on immediate suspension," Baker said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Effective now. Internal Affairs is investigating, and if they find what I think they will—" He shook his head, a smirk barely suppressed. "Your career is over." Briggs felt like he'd been gut-punched. His face burned, his pulse pounded. "This is bull—" "Don't finish that sentence." Baker's tone was ice. "Pack up your desk, and if I were you, I'd get a lawyer." Briggs clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. His world was crumbling, and for the first time, the realization hit him. He wasn't untouchable. Across the city in a quiet corner cafe, Renee stirred her coffee, scrolling through her phone. The case had already exploded across the internet. Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested. Officer under investigation. She wasn't surprised. The moment Briggs pulled her over, she had known exactly how it would unfold. She'd seen his type before. Entitled, arrogant, accustomed to twisting the law to fit his will. But this time, he'd lost. Her phone buzzed. A message from her attorney. Briggs has been suspended. Might face charges. Renee took a slow sip of her coffee. Good. She gazed out the window, watching life move on. The fight wasn't over. Not for her, not for the others Briggs had hurt. But today was a win. The air outside carried the scent of fresh rain as she stepped into the afternoon light. The weight of the past 24 hours should have pressed down on her. But it didn't. She walked as she always did, head high, steps steady. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the number. Familiar. With a sigh, she answered. "Captain? Lieutenant Commander," the voice greeted her. "I assume you've seen the news." "I have?" A brief silence. "How are you feeling?" Renee caught a reflection in a storefront window. No cracks in her composure, no signs of defeat. Like I did exactly what I was supposed to do. The captain's voice softened. "That's what I thought you'd say." A pause. Then, "The Department of Defense is taking an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it." Renee exhaled through her nose. "Not sure I'm interested in being a headline." "You already are," the captain countered. "Whether you like it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something bigger." She knew that. She had always known that. Briggs wasn't an isolated case. He was a product of a system that had allowed officers like him to thrive, unchecked. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had been in her position, but lacked the rank, the legal team, the voice to fight back. Leaning against a streetlight, she watched the traffic flow past. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," she said, "and it won't be the last." "No," the captain agreed, "but it's the first time Briggs is facing consequences, and it's because you didn't back down." Renee closed her eyes for a moment, letting those words settle. She hadn't backed down. Not when Briggs pulled her over, not when he tried to intimidate her, not when the cuffs tightened around her wrists, not even when she sat in a cold holding cell, knowing the deck had been stacked against her. And now she had won. The captain cleared his throat. "One last thing," he added. "You might be getting a call from the mayor's office." Renee's eyebrows lifted. "Oh? They want to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace." She smirked. "Now that's ironic." The captain chuckled. "You gonna accept it?" She thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I'll think about it." Ending the call, she slipped her phone back into her pocket. Across the street, a mother walked hand in hand with her young son. The boy laughed at something, his joy uninhibited, his world still safe. Renee watched them for a moment. She had fought for herself, yes, but also for him, for every child who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Briggs couldn't wield their badges like weapons. Taking a deep breath, she turned and walked away. Her steps were firm, her purpose clear. Because this fight wasn't just hers. It never had been. Power unchecked is power abused. What happened to Renee happens every day, to people without the privilege of rank, connections, or evidence to back them up. That's why we must speak up, demand change, refuse to stay silent. If this story made you think, share it. If it made you angry, talk about it. If it made you realize how much work is left to do, stay engaged. Because real change starts with real conversations.